of a rocket manufacturer went wrong.
Palestinian fighters stand watch over the rubble. 8 people were killed here, including a local leader of Islamic Jihad, a militant group closely allied with Hamas. The two groups are behind almost all rocket attacks on Israel.
He's saying that they'll fight the Israelis with every means available to them, with RPGs, with suicide bombings, with roadside bombs.
Israel blames the Hamas government for the activities of all militant groups in Gaza. It says rocket attacks will only bring more suffering to all Gazans. And as rocket attacks have escalated, so Israel has intensified its siege by closing all border crossings into Gaza and restricting fuel and medical and electrical supplies. The lack of electricity means that every day engineers have to ration the flow, and that means almost every neighbourhood must be cut off for several hours a day.
There's a mechanics workshop here, which is about to get turned off, and then right next door to it is a maternity ward, which obviously can't work without electricity.
The operation can only be done by hand.
Ramsey's having to pull these fuses manually out of a whole load of boxes, like giant versions of a fuse box at home. I'm following Ramsey to his next stop where he's got to go and turn the electricity off, and he said that the community there can be a bit dodgy and they get very angry when he comes to turn them off.
And as Ramsey got to work, an angry crowd gathered.
This is the sort of tinderbox situation that exists in Gaza because of the Israeli siege. This gentleman saying, why are you cutting off our electricity? We can't live, this is winter, it's cold, what are our children going to use for food and heat? Mohammed saying that he's paying the price for what the Israelis are doing here, for the cuts in fuel and for the fact that they're restricting the electrical supply. The Israelis say they restrict the electrical supply because the rockets keep getting fired into Israel.
The engineers said that the rockets were just Israel's latest excuse, after years of occupation and abuse.
He's saying that the restrictions on power supplies are part of pressure that Israel has been putting on Gaza for years.
The blockade has now been in force for 10 months since the Hamas takeover. It has affected every aspect of life here. A group of British charities recently said that as a consequence of the rockets and the siege, conditions in Gaza were now worse than they have been for 40 years.
One of the consequences of constant electricity cuts in Gaza is that the sewage system apparently breaks down. I'm at a pumping station in a place called Zaytun on the edge of Gaza City, and this street has been flooded with untreated human excrement. It stinks.
Ahmed Mohammed has hired a contractor to suck up the filth bubbling out of the ground by his home.
Ahmed's house is about 150 yards from the pumping station. He's complaining that when the sewage system overflows, it comes right up to his front door, goes into the foundations of the house, and it's even been into the house. So is this water from the sewage? Oh, God, it's coming up through the toilet. Ahmed, who do you blame for this?
He's reluctant to say who he thinks is to blame.
Ahmed's saying that he's not responsible for firing the rockets. He can't stop the people who are responsible for firing the rockets, and why should he be punished along with his children and everybody in this city, in this whole area, for the actions of a few?
All Gazans suffer because of the rocket attacks on Israel, but Hamas has continued its bombardment. Over 500 missiles have been fired in the first 3 months of this year.
It's Qassam. Is it? There's a trace of smoke just about 300, 400 yards from me. Just as I was getting out of the car, there was a shocking sound which I thought was an overflying jet. Turns out to be some Qassam rockets that have just been fired into Israel. We've now just driven past where the rockets were launched from, an area where a lot of children are still playing football.
Hamas came to power promising an end to the faction fighting which had characterized the rule of the Fatah-dominated authority in Gaza. Since then, Hamas has brutally suppressed Fatah opposition voices here. Many Gaza residents now fear to even use the government hospitals which are run by Hamas, turning instead to agencies like Médecins Sans Frontières. Brian Muller is the Gaza director for MSF.
We find that patients with affiliations to the Fatah movement A very, very remiss to access care in Hamas-controlled institutions.
They're using medical aid as a tool,
Yeah, exactly.
as a political tool of pressure.
Exactly. For the Palestinian people, healthcare has become just another way that pressure can be exerted one way or the other.
This is the main MSF clinic in Gaza City. And Brian's told me that the reason they had to set this up was a lot of people fear going to the hospital, which is just a few hundred yards away.
Many patients here have wounds inflicted by Hamas gunmen.
And most gunshot wounds to the lower legs.
Lower legs, punishment shootings.
Yes.
Approximately 7 to 8.
They say they were attacked because of their association with the deposed Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority.
This is Honey. He was injured 4 days before the Hamas takeover. He's a soldier in the Palestinian Authority. And he says 7 or 8 guys came to his home and he fled them. And he's saying that he's afraid of going to any of the mainstream Palestinian hospitals because he's afraid he'll get arrested. Hi.
Hani escaped. His 2 sisters did not.
بعد بدهم يجي ياخذوا من البيت تم اطلاق النار علينا كنا يعني مسكناهم هم يعني.
This is Maha. She's the sister of Hani, who I've just interviewed. He escaped when Hamas came to their home, but Maha and her other sister were not so lucky. They sprayed the whole household with bullets, and Maha was hit in the leg and the stomach.
And what do you feel about Hamas now that they've shot you in the legs and the stomach? You hate Hamas?
Hamas claims it is taking steps to minimize incidents such as these, but it appears determined to crush all opposition in Gaza. In return, it says, it has brought ordinary locals stability and order on the streets. But violent gangs threaten that stability, as I learned in a call from Hamas security.
The head of the executive force got intelligence that there's a high level of threat against foreigners.
We were told not to move from our hotel and that Hamas agents would come to us.
Salam alaikum.
They took the calls seriously. They have deployed something like 5 cars with whatever is under control. There's 2.
We were told that 40 Hamas guards had surrounded our hotel to guard us.
Right, well, got some clarity at least. The threat against us is against us. That is confirmed, and it's a result of an intercepted telephone conversation between 2 would-be kidnappers. So we decided to take the offer of an escort from the Hamas security forces and go out to Israel and regroup and think again about how we can work in Gaza.
The next morning, we were given uniformed policemen from Hamas as bodyguards.
Hamas are known internationally as a terrorist organisation responsible for suicide bombings inside Israel, and they're blamed for allowing the rockets to continue to be fired into Israeli territory. We're now relying on them for our safety.
Hamas had managed to foil a kidnap attempt, and as we were driven under escort to the crossing with Israel, it was clear that it wanted to demonstrate that it was a functioning government. Within 48 hours, I was called by a senior Hamas official. He claimed that those alleged to be responsible for the kidnap plot had been arrested.
How are you?
So I returned to Gaza with a Hamas escort to ask its leadership to explain the logic behind attacking Israel with indiscriminate rockets when Palestinians suffer as a consequence. Ahmed Yusuf is a top advisor to the party.
How are you coping with running an administration here in Gaza without all of this foreign aid that has been switched off?
If they cut the electricity, stop sending fuel and something like, we will cope actually with these things because.
But will it make you more or less popular? The Palestinians suffer a great deal when the Israelis counterattack or cut your electricity or restrict your water.
It doesn't break the will of the Palestinians. We keep this struggle ongoing.
But therefore, what is your game plan? Are you just going to carry on firing rockets into Israel?
You can't surrender. You have to keep defending yourself. You have to face the Israeli aggression with whatever military equipment that you have. This is the only way we have to defend ourselves. And making our enemy to bleed the same way we are bleeding and feeling the same pain that we are feeling, that's fine. We might be able to make it lethal.
Hamas believes that if it wants to lead the Palestinian cause, it must show it can stand up to Israel. Rockets are its weapon of choice. And we crossed into Israel to find out if the missile strikes were having the effect that Hamas hoped.
I'm heading for Sderot, which is a small town very, very close to Gaza, which is frequently hit by the rockets fired by the Palestinian militants.
and there's been one, I've been told, just this morning. The residents of Sderot live less than a kilometre from the border with Gaza.
Ah, this is where the bomb landed, was it?
The owner of this house told us what happened.
Oh, yeah, the walls were absolutely... So the bomb landed just about an hour ago, right at lunchtime, in the garden, obviously right next to where children could have been playing. It's spattered his house with shrapnel, and he's saying that all of his neighbours around here have had bombs landing in, shattering windows, landing in the garden.
For the people of Sderot, daily rocket attacks have become a way of life. I dropped in on the Sassoon family, who had also been recently hit.
It was a rocket that landed 2 months ago, came through the roof of their neighbour's house, punched a hole in the wall of the garden. Miraculously, it didn't hurt or kill anybody.
It was a lucky escape, but it left the family terrified. Moshe now lives like a refugee in his own home.
My God.
Moshe is saying that every night they have to sleep here in the living room, all squished together, and every time the siren goes off, they come into this homemade shelter and stand up, put their hands over their ears and pray to God that it won't hit them this time.
An average of around 3 rockets a day land in this one small town. They are indiscriminate in their targets. While we were in Sderot, one fell on a local college.
One rocket fall here, and some student walking here died. They want to destroy you. That's what they want. So you should give them in the same way they want. They understand when you hurt them.
Hamas and other militant factions in Gaza have fired more than 2,000 rockets, known as Qassams, into Israel in the last 2 years.
This is the warehouse, as it were, where the used Qassam rockets are being kept, outside the back of the police station.
Despite being the leading military power in the region, Israel seems powerless to stop these primitive weapons.
So every one of these rockets is homemade. These are not made in an arms factory, but in a shed, in a workshop somewhere in Gaza.
Many Palestinians think that the continuing rocket fire might eventually force Israel into talking with Hamas. But Hamas has been shunned internationally as a terrorist organisation and excluded from all negotiations. Instead, the world has put its faith in Hamas's rival Fatah, which controls the West Bank part of the Palestinian territories.
The West Bank is in control of the PA, which is dominated by Fatah, and hundreds of Hamas supporters have been rounded up and jailed here.
America and Europe have backed Fatah in their campaign against Hamas here, but I wanted to know whether Fatah was winning. Just as I arrived on the West Bank, I came across a familiar scene.
These are mostly students, he's saying, protesting at the death of Majdi Barghouti, who's a prominent imam from the village of Koba, about 5 kilometers away from here.
Not long ago, the Palestinians were fighting Israelis here. Now, they're fighting each other.
This is Diab Naim, he's from the village of Koba. He says the sheikh was humiliated, tortured and murdered by the Palestinian police.
Fatah controls all the police and security forces on the West Bank. Human rights groups accuse it of a campaign of repression against Hamas activists. We caught up with the sheikh's funeral cortege. His body was being taken home in an ambulance, but it had been pulled up by the side of the road.
The Hamas supporters who want to attend this funeral are being stopped. They're being held up in the city because they're waving Hamas banners.
Some members of Fatah turned up. They were not welcome. When they started waving their yellow party flags, it almost caused a fight. It's a sign of disunity the mourners didn't want us to see. The government of Fatah on the West Bank is committed to negotiating peace with Israel. Hamas refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist and has been excluded from talks. But its supporters insist that no peace deal can be struck without them.
Any sense that the Hamas party is dead on the West Bank? It's certainly not true today. There's a crowd here of, 5 to 10,000.
The sheikh's body had only been released to the family 2 hours earlier. They were anxious to check for signs of torture.